In the autumn of the year 1223, a column of Mongol horsemen advanced through the steppes south of the Volga, riding with the confidence of men who had known no defeat in more than 2 years of uninterrupted campaign. They had crossed Persia, they had devastated Georgia, they had traversed the Caucasus in the dead of winter, they had annihilated Cumans, Alans, Circassians, and barely months before had destroyed a Russian army 3 times their size on the banks of the Kalka River, leaving 40,000 dead and 6 captured princes buried alive beneath the earth. These were the men of Subutai and Jebe, the 2 finest generals of Genghis Khan, and the world trembled at their passing. No one had stopped them. No one seemed capable of doing so. But to the north of the great bend in the Volga, where the mighty river describes an immense horseshoe curve, a people awaited them. Not with fear, not with tributes or supplicating ambassadors, with ambushes. The Volga Bulgars, a Muslim people of merchants and warriors settled between the Volga and Kama rivers, had heard the rumors of the storm approaching from the south. And instead of fleeing, they prepared a trap. And when the Mongols penetrated that territory, following what appeared to be an enemy in retreat, the silence of the forests and riverbanks broke all at once. Warriors surged from every direction. Arrows rained from hidden positions. The column was struck from the flanks, from the rear, from impossible angles. The steppe riders, hunters turned prey, found themselves trapped in an encirclement that closed with lethal precision. Screams echoed among the trees. Horses fell, blood soaked the earth. And when the dust settled and the echo of the massacre faded, the army that had never been defeated lay shattered on the banks of the Volga. The first great defeat of the Mongol Empire had been inflicted not by a colossal empire, but by a people the world barely knew existed. This is the story of how it happened. To grasp the magnitude of what occurred at the Samara Bend, one must go back to the year 1219, when Genghis Khan unleashed his fury against the Khwarazmian Empire, the powerful Islamic state that stretched from the Caspian Sea to Afghanistan. Sultan Muhammad II of Khwarezm had committed the fatal error of executing Mongol ambassadors, an offense that in steppe culture was equivalent to a declaration of total war. Genghis's response was apocalyptic. In less than 2 years, the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur and Herat were razed, their populations massacred, their fields destroyed, their irrigation canals shattered. Sultan Muhammad fled like a hunted animal, pursued across Persia by 2 Mongol generals whom Genghis had dispatched with a precise order. Find him, and if 1,000 men died along the way, it did not matter, but the Sultan must not escape. Those 2 generals were Subutai and Jebe, and the mission that began as a pursuit would become the most audacious reconnaissance expedition in military history. Subutai was the son of a blacksmith from the Urian-Kai tribe. He was not of noble blood, not a kinsman of Genghis. He had arrived at the future Khan's camp at the age of 14, following in the footsteps of his elder brother Jebe, and had risen through pure merit to become one of the 4 supreme generals of the empire. He was a strategist without equal, a man who thought in distances of thousands of kilometers and coordinated armies separated by weeks of march with a precision that would have astonished commanders of any era. Genghis called him one of his war dogs, and he said it as the highest of compliments. Jebe, his comrade in arms, was a warrior of a different temper. Bold to the point of recklessness, he led from the front, always galloping in the first line of the charge. His name meant arrow in Mongolian, and legend held that he had earned it because in an early battle he had fired an arrow that nearly killed Genghis himself. Rather than execute him, Genghis recruited him, recognizing in that young archer a ferocity that could not be wasted. Together, Subutai and Jebe form perhaps the most lethal combination of generals in ancient history. Genghis assigned them 2 tumens, some 20,000 horsemen, and gave them permission to explore the lands west of the Caspian Sea, on the condition that the campaign not last more than 2 years, and that on their return they locate Joshi, the Khan's firstborn, and join him to subdue the Volga Bulgars. What followed was a whirlwind of destruction and military genius that swept across half a continent. By the end of winter in 1221, the Mongols invaded Georgia, crushing the army of King George IV on the plain of Kunan. The king was mortally wounded. The Mongols sacked southern Georgia and then descended into Azerbaijan, where they took and destroyed Maragay, using prisoners as cannon fodder in the assault's vanguard. They considered attacking Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, but calculated that the effort did not justify the risk and continued northward. They crossed the Caucasus in the dead of winter, a feat that modern military historians still consider nearly impossible. The mountain passes were covered in snow and ice. Horses slipped on the precipices. The local guides they had obtained in Derbent attempted to lead them through dangerous routes, and the Mongols executed one of them as a warning. When they emerged on the other side of the mountains, exhausted and diminished, they encountered a coalition of 50,000 warriors, Cumans, Alans, Circassians, and Lezgins, reinforced by Volga Bulgar allies, Khazars and Avars. It was a force more than twice their size. Subutai could not win in a frontal clash. So he resorted to diplomacy and treachery. He sent messengers to the Cumans, reminding them that Mongols and Cumans were steppe peoples, brothers in blood, and offered them half the plunder taken in Georgia if they would abandon their allies. The Cumans accepted. They broke camp during the night and departed, leaving the Alans, Circassians and Lezgins alone before the horde. The Mongols destroyed them without mercy, and then, with terrifying speed, they pursued and massacred the very Cumans they had bribed, recovering the treasure and annihilating their leaders. The steppe south of Russia was cleared of enemies. Subutai sent scouts westward, made contact with Venetian merchants on the shores of the Sea of Azov, exchanged military intelligence for commercial promises, and then turned his gaze northward, where the Russian princes were gathering an enormous army to confront him. In May of 1223, a coalition of Russian princes and Cumans, some 80,000 men, according to the most generous sources, marched against the Mongols. Subutai sent ambassadors proposing peace and arguing that his quarrel was only with the Cumans, not the Russians. Prince Mstislav of Kiev executed the ambassadors. Subutai sent a second embassy declaring war. And then he did something that would define his genius forever. He retreated. For 9 days the Mongol army withdrew eastward, pursued by the Russians, who interpreted the retreat as fear. The Russian column stretched thin, the different retinues of the various princes separated. Discipline dissolved in the excitement of what appeared to be easy prey, exactly what Subutai wanted. On the 31st of May, on the banks of the Kalka River, the Mongols halted, turned, and destroyed the Russian army with terrifying efficiency. The Russian vanguard was annihilated before the rearguard even reached the battlefield. The Cumans fled first, spreading panic through the Russian ranks. The Mongol heavy cavalry charged the flanks. Mounted archers turned the field into a slaughterhouse. 40,000 Russians and Cumans died that day. 6 princes were captured and executed in a manner that Russian chroniclers would remember with horror for centuries. The Mongols placed them beneath a wooden platform and held their victory banquet on top of it, slowly crushing them to death while they ate and drank. Kalka was one of the most crushing victories in military history, and Subutai had achieved it with forces vastly inferior in number after years of continuous campaign, thousands of kilometers from any supply base in completely unknown territory. But the mission was not over. Genghis Khan had ordered them to locate Jochi on the return journey and subdue the Volga Bulgars. the prosperous commercial state that controlled the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, northeast of the steppes they had just devastated. The Volga Bulgars were a people little known to the world, but possessed of remarkable wealth and organization. Of Turkic origin, they had migrated northward from the Pontic steppes in the 7th century, settling in the region where the Volga receives the Kama. In the year 922, they had officially adopted Islam, becoming the northernmost Muslim state on earth. Their capital, Bilyar, was a fortified and prosperous city. They controlled the trade routes connecting the Islamic world with Scandinavia and the Slavic lands, trading in furs, honey, wax, amber, and slaves. They were merchants, but also warriors. For decades, they had fought against the expansion of the southern Russian principalities, defending their cities and territory with a tenacity that their neighbors had learned to respect. And when the rumors of the Mongol storm began arriving from the south, when news of the Khalkha massacre swept across the steppes like wildfire, the Volga Bulgars did not panic. Their ruler, the Iltaberg Abdullah Chelbir, a leader who had held power for decades, understood clearly what was approaching. He had heard the stories. He knew what the Mongols had done in Khwarazm, in Georgia, on the Cuman steppes, in the Russian lands. He knew that brute force would not suffice against the steppe horsemen, the most skilled in the world at warfare of movement. But he knew something the Mongols did not know. His land. He knew the dense forests to the south of his domains, the winding banks of the Volga, the narrow passes between the rivers, the natural defiles that geography had carved over millennia. And he understood that the only way to defeat the invincible was to turn their own arrogance into a weapon. The Mongols expected the Bulgars to flee, as the Cumans had fled. The Alans, the Georgians, the Russians, they expected submission or frontal resistance. What they did not expect was for someone to return their own tactic to them. The feigned retreat. Chelbir gathered his forces and his Mordvin allies under the command of the tribal chiefs Puresh and Purgaz. He arranged ambushes along the routes the Mongols would use to penetrate Bulgar territory. He posted hidden warriors in the forests, on the riverbanks, at the bends in the road, where thick vegetation and rough terrain negated the advantage of Mongol cavalry in open country. And he sent a vanguard force with a single order. When the Mongols appear, pretend to fight, then flee. Draw them inward. Let them believe you are frightened. Let them taste another easy victory. The trap was set. When Subutai and Jebe crossed the Volga and approached the southern frontier of Volga Bulgaria, their army was no longer the 20,000 men who had departed from the shores of the Caspian 2 years before. Continuous campaigns, battles, forced marches, disease and casualties accumulated in Georgia, in the Caucasus, on the steppes at Khalkha, had considerably diminished their forces. Historians debate the exact number, but Subutai likely had several thousand horsemen, perhaps half or less of his original force. Even so, they were Mongols, veterans hardened by 2 years of uninterrupted combat, men who had defeated armies 5 times their size without flinching. The confidence that pulsed in their veins was more solid than any armor, and it was that confidence that killed them. Mongol scouts detected Bulgar forces to the south of their territory, near the bend of the Samara, where the Volga describes its great arc eastward before continuing its long descent toward the Caspian. The Bulgars appeared disorganized. They were falling back. They offered sporadic resistance, loosing arrows from a distance before turning their horses and fleeing northward. For any Mongol commander, the sight was familiar. It was what weak enemies did, what the Cumans had done before being destroyed, what the Russians had done before Khalkha. Subutai, the strategist who had made the feigned retreat into an art, must have recognized the tactic. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he was too exhausted after 2 years of campaign. Perhaps the loss of Jebe, who, according to some sources, died during the return journey, possibly from disease or wounds, left him without his usual complement, without the eyes that covered the angles he could not see. Or perhaps his intelligence on the Bulgars was simply insufficient. He had explored half of Eurasia, but the lands north of the Volga remained a mystery. He did not know the terrain. He did not know the enemy. What we know from the sources is what follows. The Mongols pursued the retreating Bulgar forces, advancing into territory that grew progressively more forested, more confined, less favorable for steppe cavalry. The open plains where mounted archers dominated the horizon gave way to dense forests, riverbanks flanked by ravines, paths winding between ancient trees. The space closed in. Speed, the Mongols' supreme weapon, became useless, and then the trap closed. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, the most detailed source to have survived, describes it with chilling precision. The Bulgars had prepared ambushes at multiple points. When the Mongols passed beyond the hidden positions, Bulgar warriors emerged at their backs. The Mongols found themselves caught in the middle. They fell to the sword from every side. Most were killed. Only a few escaped. It is impossible to reconstruct the exact sequence of the ambush from the surviving fragments. But we can imagine what the Mongols experienced, because it was precisely what they had done to so many others so many times before. The silence first. That moment when the forest becomes too quiet, when the birds stop singing and the wind seems to hold its breath. Then the first scream, not from the front but from behind. The sound of felled trees crashing across the road, blocking the retreat. The whistle of arrows from elevated positions, from the flanks, from directions no scout had reported. The instant confusion of a cavalry column trapped in a space where it cannot deploy, where horses collide with one another, where every attempt at an orderly formation shatters against the trees and the slopes. The Bulgars did not fight like the Russians, who had charged headlong into Mongol arrows. They did not fight like the Cumans, who had broken and fled at first contact. They fought like hunters who knew every inch of their terrain. They struck from every angle, cut off the escape routes, and transformed the Mongol column into a series of isolated pockets of desperate men fighting to survive. The casualty figures are uncertain. Ibn al-Athir mentions that 4,000 men survived on the Mongol side, though modern historians debate whether that figure refers to the survivors or the total size of the detachment. What is clear is that Subutai's army suffered a serious defeat, the most grievous a Mongol force had experienced since the start of the Great Expansion under Genghis Khan. The Bulgars captured equipment, horses and prisoners who were later exchanged for livestock. Subutai survived. The military genius who had coordinated the destruction of empires from Persia to Ukraine managed to extract what remained of his force from the Bulgar encirclement and retreated to the southeast, rounding the Urals. But the defeat had left its mark. Not on his body, which according to all sources possessed superhuman endurance, but on the legend of invincibility that the Mongols had woven over years of unbroken victories. For the first time, a people had used the Mongols' own tactics against them. For the first time, the feigned retreat, the weapon Subutai had employed with devastating effect in the Caucasus, against the Cumans, against the Russians, had been turned against him. Jebe did not survive the campaign. The circumstances of his death are obscure. Some sources suggest he died of illness during the return journey. Others hint that he may have fallen in an earlier engagement, perhaps during the Battle of Khalkha or in some minor skirmish. The Mongols had a custom of not speaking of the deaths of their generals, so the truth was lost in the deliberate silence of the steppe. What is certain is that one of the two most brilliant generals of the Mongol Empire did not return alive, and the Chinese sources that record the careers of Subutai and Jebe make no mention of the battle against the Bulgars, a silence that some historians interpret as a deliberate act of omission, the Mongol custom of erasing defeats from official memory. After the ambush, the remnants of the Mongol army continued their journey eastward. Subutai still had sufficient force to attack the Kangli Cumans in the Urals, where he defeated their army and killed their Khan, forcing them to pay tribute. This suggests that although the defeat at Samara was painful, it was not entirely annihilating. Subutai retained enough combat capability to confront lesser enemies. But the fact that he avoided any further confrontation with the Volga Bulgars and skirted their territory rather than crossing it says much about the respect, or the fear, that the ambush had instilled in him. When Subutai finally rejoined Genghis Khan east of the Sir Darya River, the great Khan received him with praise for the expedition's achievements. Khalkha, Georgia, the Caucasus, the intelligence gathered on the Western kingdoms. All of this outweighed a defeat against a semi-barbarian people on the fringes of the empire. But Genghis did not forget. The Mongols never forgot. The silence that followed the Battle of the Samara Bend was deceptive. For the Volga Bulgars, it was a moment of immense and justified pride. They had accomplished what Georgians, Cumans, Alans, and Russians could not. They had stopped the invincible steppe horsemen, defeated them at their own game, sent them back east with open wounds and a shattered legend. Mongol prisoners were displayed and ransomed, captured weapons were distributed. In the markets of Bilyar and Bulgar, merchants spoke of the victory with a pride that future generations would forge into legend. But the celebration had an expiration date. The Mongols had been defeated but not destroyed, and the Mongols did not forget offenses. In 1229, the first Mongol incursion struck again at the southern borders of Volga Bulgaria. In 1232, another wave. These were probing strikes, explorations of the terrain and defenses, exactly the kind of methodical reconnaissance that characterized Mongol operations before a large-scale invasion. And in 1236, the storm arrived. This time, it was not a reconnaissance detachment of a few thousand exhausted horsemen. It was the army of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, commanding 150,000 men, the largest force the Mongols had ever assembled for a Western campaign. And riding alongside Batu as chief strategist was a man who knew these lands well, who remembered with implacable precision the forests, the river bends, the positions of the ambushes. Subutai had returned. Volga Bulgaria was razed with a ferocity that suggested something beyond military strategy. Bilyar, the capital, was besieged and taken. The city was burned. Its population was massacred or enslaved. The other Bulgar cities met the same fate. Bulgar, the ancient commercial capital, was destroyed. Fields were burned. Irrigation canals were cut. Within months, 6 centuries of Volga Bulgar civilization were reduced to ashes. The people who had humiliated the Mongols paid a disproportionate price for that victory 13 years earlier. But the significance of the Battle of the Samara Bend transcends its tragic epilogue. In the autumn of 1223, at a forgotten bend in the Volga, a people demonstrated something the world had begun to consider impossible: that the Mongols could be defeated, that the horde was not invulnerable, that tactical intelligence, knowledge of the terrain, and audacity could negate the superiority of the finest cavalry in history. The Volga Bulgars used against Subutai the very weapon Subutai had employed to destroy half of Eurasia: the feigned retreat, the prepared ambush, terrain converted into an ally. It was an act of military genius that medieval chroniclers barely recorded, because the Volga Bulgars lacked the written tradition of the Chinese or the network of chroniclers of the Western Europeans. Their victory was real, but their voice was silenced by history. And there is something more in this battle that deserves to be remembered. Subutai, the greatest strategist of the Mongol era, perhaps the greatest strategist of the entire Middle Ages, was defeated not by a rival of his caliber, not by an individual genius whose name would resonate in military manuals, but by a collective people who understood that the only way to defeat a predator is to know its nature better than it knows itself. The Bulgars did not invent a new tactic. They took the enemy's tactic and gave it back to him. In war, few things are more elegant or more lethal. Today, the Samara Bend still exists. The Volga still describes that immense arc eastward, surrounding the Zhiguli Hills before continuing its long descent toward the Caspian. The city of Samara stands on its banks, bustling and indifferent. No monument marks the exact spot where Bulgar warriors surged from among the trees, where Mongol horsemen fell from their horses, where the legend of invincibility of the most powerful empire of the 13th century cracked for the first time. But beneath the silent current of the river, beneath the wind that traverses the steppes as it did 800 years ago, the echo of that ambush persists, a reminder that no empire, however vast, is immune to the cunning of those who defend their own land. A whisper that says history does not always belong to the strongest, but to those who know how to wait for the precise moment to strike. Because at the Samara Bend, a forgotten people stopped the invincible. And although the Mongols would return 13 years later with force enough to erase them from the map, nothing could erase what happened that autumn. The first defeat of the Mongol Empire was not inflicted by a great army. It was inflicted by a people who knew their forests, who understood their enemy, and who had the courage to return the hunter's own trap to him.